Today, we're going to go over how to use this Notion template for a segment analytics tracking plan. A tracking plan in Segment is the place where we lay out and document all of our track, identify, group calls, everything you need to implement Segment so that way you can actually start getting value out of your Segment instance. This Notion template here is designed to be used by non-technical teams. So a marketing, product, or even an executive could use this template to create their tracking plan. At the end of creating this tracking plan, you should have a really clear idea of what events are going to be fired in Segment, when they're going to be fired, and it'll serve as documentation for your plan. So that way, when you onboard new people or you want to hire a data analyst to look at your Segment data, they could look at your tracking plan and see where they expect events, what events they can use to analyze your data. At the end of creating this plan, you should be able to hand this over to a developer and they should be able to go implement it with minimal feedback from you. So that's why we need a tracking plan like this. So let's dive into how to use it. So first, it's a Notion template. So you're going to click the duplicate button over here and duplicate the template over to your own workspace. After you do that, it's going to look like this. It's going to be an exact copy of this. You'll see here that we have a lot of tips and information bubbles as you go through the plan about how to use the plan. And if you need help, you can schedule a consultation with me or contact me directly here. So without further ado, let's jump into each of the things we need to do. First and foremost, we really need to define goals of the tracking plan. The biggest mistake that I see, or one of the bigger mistakes that I see people make when they're doing any analytics, and especially when they're creating their tracking plan, is they sort of come in and they say, we want to track everything, right? We just want to track everything on the website. But that's really kind of meaningless. If you're tracking everything, you're really tracking nothing. You want to track the things that are important to fulfill your goals in your web analytics. So I have a couple of example goals here, right? These are the things that typically, very typically people are using Segment. So for instance, you might want to, we have to track our own web analytics to our database to see customer lifetime value by original traffic source. That's a great reason to use Segment. That's not something that you could, for instance, get with Google Analytics or any of these other tracking tools out there, right? So think about your goals. Think about why you're implementing Segment. Put those right here at the top. So that way you don't forget them. It will also help you communicate with your development team and help them understand, why are we doing this? Oftentimes, marketing really cares about analytics. Product really cares about analytics. Developers oftentimes, they feel like they have bigger fish to fry, right? So it's important to communicate why we're doing this in the first place right up top. Cool. Now let's get into the details of how we're going to start defining our tracking plan. First, we're just going to put some information about our Segment workspace here. So here, you're going to link to the Segment workspace. So this is your Segment workspace, right? You can see I would link to the overview page. You have a different slug here. This is my Segment workspace, but we'll just copy this, edit the link, and put it in like that. Good. Cool. Oops. Good. Next, we need to define all of our sources. So sources in Segment are defined over here. You can see this. Now, we don't need to put in all of these sources because some of the sources that I have listed here are ETL sources or pre-built sources, right? So those are Klaviyo, SendGrid, Google Ads, Facebook Ads. You may have some of those as well. Those are really just going to the data warehouse, right? They're not being pumped to our other destinations. The sources that we care about for the tracking plan are the custom sources. So those are usually JavaScript, might be an iOS, Android app. There might be a marketing site. This is pretty typical. We have a marketing site that might be a WordPress site or a Webflow site. If we're a SaaS app, we often have a web app as well. So that would be the actual custom app. That's fairly typical. You might also see some node or other server-side sources, right? Those are events that are firing server-side. So you can see here that in our segment instance, for each custom source, we have a development and a production instance. For the purposes of the tracking plan, there's really no distinction between the two. So we're just going to create a source for each of these, right? So the way you do that is click on sources, and it'll take you to these sources. Now, this is the tracking plan is pre-populated with a lot of things that are common, right? So you may not have a marketing site and a web app. If you don't, just delete them. That's fine, right? If you do, and they're named something else, just go ahead and rename them, right? It might not be a marketing site. It might be WordPress site or something, right? That's totally fine. Cool. You may have additional sources. So like over here, if I were filling this out, there's a node server here that's sending data to our different destinations. And so I would go ahead and create one here that was, what did we call it? I would call it the same thing that it's called in segment, just so it's clear to the developers and everybody else where this should be firing from. Cool. So this is going to be app server, right? You don't have to fill out anything else here except the segment link. So click on the link like this. And there you go. Cool. These all relations in Notion, they'll be filled out later as we're going through and creating our identify, event, track calls, and as we create our various tasks. So don't worry about filling those in just yet. You can see that on each page we're going to go through, there's some documentation about how to do this as well. Okay, good. Now, just a real quick, why do we define each source? The reason why is as we create these events and identify calls, we're going to want to verify that each of them are actually firing. And the way we can do that is we can click on the link, it'll open the link in segment, right? And we can go over to the schema in segment. So these are the events that we're going to go through in this plan that we want to fire. Here in the actual sources, we can see if they're firing. And if we click on it, we can see the properties. We're going to go over each of these that have been firing. Now, sometimes this gets a little bit outdated, this here, and you can actually clear the schema. So if you go to settings, you can clear the schema and refresh it. That will clear all of the schema from the debugger. So from the schema tab here, you'll see nothing in here. And then in a few days, if you have a fair amount of traffic, you should see this start to match your tracking plan. So that's a useful tip. If you finish your tracking plan and the developers have implemented, good idea to clear your schema. Okay. All right. So we've added all of our sources here. So let's go back to the homepage of the tracking plan. Cool. And the next thing we want to do is define a naming convention. So naming conventions are really critical to success in segment, right? You'll often see a problem when you just sort of let people don't have a strong naming convention, don't have a naming convention defined, is you'll see things like this. Sometimes an event is called a purchase event. Sometimes it's called order completed, right? Sometimes things are capitalized. It's user login, uppercase, but it's user signed up lowercase, right? And there's no real standard way to define your things. That will make your data analysis on the back end of segment much more difficult. It will be much more difficult to understand what is happening. So if you don't have a naming convention defined already, I strongly recommend that you use segments naming convention, their default naming convention. That's the object action framework. I talk a little bit about it here, right? This is what it looks like. The object action framework is you have an object, for instance, user, and then the action, which is what happened, right? The user signed up. In this case, the object is user, the action is signed up. The action is always a past tense verb, right? And we use proper case for those things, right? So that is the object action framework. The benefit of following the object action framework is that one, these segment semantic events, these are the events that Segment has predefined for you, a lot of which are already available in the events in the template, so you don't have to go through and define them yourselves, right? Are used, they all use the object action framework. So you can see here, this is e-commerce events, cart viewed, right? It's not cart view, right? It's cart viewed. The reason why it is so beneficial, this is one of the most beneficial things about using Segment specifically and not doing your own analytics tools in Google Tag Manager or something, right? Is because if you follow these semantic events and you use the object action naming convention, Segment will automatically translate the event that you've defined as the semantic event into what the destination expects it to look like. So for instance, an order completed event in Segment will translate that to the purchase event that Facebook expects. So here, for instance, we have in our connections, we're sending a purchase event from the web app in our case. Right? When this gets sent over to the Facebook pixel expects that to be called a purchase event. It doesn't expect it to be called order completed. If you define it as order completed, Segment will do the translation for you. However, if you define it as something else, if you defined it as order complete, you weren't following the naming convention or something like that, Segment doesn't know that that is the proper semantic order completed event, and it won't translate it for you. So strong recommendation that if you're just starting out, you follow the object action framework defined by Segment. There's a link to the documentation here. It's pretty well described here. Cool. The other part of the object action framework is we use snake case for properties. Snake case means that we have to replace spaces with something in code. We can't have spaces like that. So snake cases, you replace them with an underbar and you have lowercase like this, all right? That is not typical for JavaScript. JavaScript by default uses something called camel case. It's not super critical here. It's not as important as getting the name of the event correct, but it just makes life much easier if you have a consistent naming convention. Snake case is the recommendation by Segment, so I recommend you use snake case for properties. Okay, cool. All right. Now let's dig into the actual laying out. So we've finished our sort of high level information about our segment instance up here. We've defined a naming convention, etc. Step 3 is to create the tracking events. Now, creating the tracking events is the bulk of the work in Segment, in defining a tracking plan. Right? This is where most of the action is happening. So, take your time with this. This is not something that you should expect to complete, in 5 minutes or something like that. But the template makes it much easier to consistently define your tracking events. So instead of this taking a couple of days, maybe it takes you 2 hours to complete your tracking plan. Cool. Might take a little bit more than that, depends on the complexity of your site and things like that. But the point is, the template can massively reduce the amount of time. Now, we've predefined a bunch of events for you here. These are the most common events. They apply to many different kinds of sites. So these are pre-populated. Not all of these might apply to you. The way to change these events is go over here. So this is what we're going to do for any event. If we're adding, editing, or create or deleting events, we're going to go to first the events page. You'll see we have the default view here. We also have some instructions and descriptions of what events are. We're going to flip it into the adding view. You'll see that there are many more columns here. And you'll see here over on the far side, there's specs. These specs are predefined events that are defined by segment or us. There's a couple, the all sites specs are the ones that we think really apply to any site. They're worth implementing on any site, right? The e-commerce spec, if we go and we click on it, for instance, it's got some information about it. It's got, again, linked to the segment documentation. This is the spec. This is the spec segments spec for e-commerce events, right? All of the major events from this spec are predefined in here, available to you. If you don't have an e-commerce store, right, you don't need these events. For instance, you didn't need product list view if you're a SaaS app. You may, but you may not need those. All you have to do is come in, filter, and filter for an event, filter for spec, contains e-commerce, and you can go ahead and just delete these events, right? Just delete them if you don't need them. Take a look carefully, right? The order completed, for instance, applies to everyone, right? So the order completed event here applies to B2B SaaS as well as e-commerce. So, be careful about which ones you're deleting here, right? We'll go over why that's the case here in a minute. Okay, cool. If you're not a B2B SaaS, of course, you can delete these events, right? Trial started is not typically relevant to e-commerce stores. Okay, I'm going to leave all the events in here for now, right? You'll notice that these events are sorted by created date, so that way as I add new events, they don't get moved around. So it's very clear how I'm adding things. But let's go over the structure of an event, of a track call. This is a track call. They're called events. They're made with the track call. You can see the segment documentation here. Cool. So let's go over the structure of these. So first, over here on the left, we have some information about progress and status. You won't have to edit anything about that. The first thing you have to do when you're creating an event is give it a name. So let's say, we're on a site and we want to track something. We want to track people who book a demo, right? So we want to track people who click this book a demo call to action, right? Cool. So we might call this book a demo clicked. And I'm just using this as an example because it's very simple to understand. We'll go over when to create events, how you should structure your events a little bit in a second. Okay, so I give this event a name, right? You can see that this is the object action framework. The object is book a demo and the action is clicked. Good. All right, now I'm going to assign properties to this event. The event at a high level, the event is the thing that gets sent to segment. Properties are information about that event, right? So here, we might be changing the text of this. I might sometimes say book a demo. I might call it, talk to sales, something like that. I don't want the book a demo event to change every time I change the text, right, of the button. So if that's the case, I could put a property of click text, right? I could also put another property. I can put as many properties as I want. You'll see again, properties are the properties table in this Notion template is pre-populated with a bunch of these, right? I could also put click URL. That might be another property. Or I might have a property, let's say that this was really important, is like the button color. Now, in this case, there's no default property for that. So I'm going to create one, right? And then I can click on this. It'll open this definition, and I can give an example of purple, right? And, the example is purple. And the description is the color of the button. Right? Something that makes it really clear to the developer, what is this property? How am I going to fill this in when the time comes for them to implement it? The type here is going to be a string, right? Pretty straightforward. A string is anything that looks like a word, right? A number is a number, so like revenue is a number, right? An array is a list. Those are developer terms, but important to define them correctly. In our case, this does not apply to any pre-existing specs, so we'll just leave it blank, right? And then we're done. Cool. All right, so now you can see that this event that we've defined, book a demo click, has three properties: click text, click URL, and button color. There's a couple other things that I do recommend you add, and they're added by default to all of these events, and that's add each. For each event, it's a good idea to fire the object and the action. Those are very useful, right? There's a couple others that I'll go through in a minute when we look at an existing event. Now we say, is it a conversion? And the way that I like to think, this is not, strictly speaking, this is not information that's being sent to Segment. We don't have to tell Segment that it's a conversion or anything. It's just useful to distinguish between conversion events and what are usually called analytics events in our tracking plan. So that way we can follow, like, okay, what are the things that are the most important events? For instance, actually completing an order or purchase is usually the most important event that's happening on an e-commerce site, right? Now, in this case, we're just talking about clicking book a demo, so that would probably not be a conversion. The way I distinguish between a conversion and an analytics event is I like to think about what are the things that I would actually want to pay a marketing source like Google Ads or Facebook to for. What would I want to actually pay them for? Of course, we are actually going to pay them for every click to the website, but what would I like to pay them for? In other words, what would I like those tools to optimize for, right? I don't really want them to optimize for book a demo button clicks. I might want to optimize for actually booking a demo, not the click, right? The click is a step on the user journey for booking a demo, but it is not booking a demo, right? So in that case, this is a false conversion. Actually booking a demo, that might be a real conversion, right? And then we simply define we attach this to the sources. It could be multiple where we expect this to take place. Usually, for like a SaaS app or an e-commerce website, there's events usually take place only on one source. But in the case that you have a mobile app, you might have a web app, an iOS app, and an Android app. You might have all three. And in that case, this event might take place on multiple places. So in this case, it only takes place on the marketing site, right? It doesn't happen within the web app. Although there might be places where, for instance, people click a live chat, that might happen on multiple sites, right? That might happen on both the web app and the marketing site. So keep that in mind. Really think about where we expect this event to fire. Okay, good. The rest of these fields, you don't have to worry about. The events that you're creating probably won't have any associated segment documentation. If they're pre-built here, they often have some segment documentation. You can click on that here, and it will define this is the segment semantic event documentation. Don't worry about tasks, or like we talked about, you're not adding things to the standard spec over here. Cool. The only other column you might think about here is the JavaScript sample code generator. So let's go ahead and copy it. And that's all you have to do with this column. It's just copy it. It's auto-generated. And you can see here that now this event, book a demo click, has been set to the status to spec. What that means is that we've created the event in the tracking plan. We haven't defined where it's supposed to happen, what it's supposed to look like, all the information that a developer would need to actually go implement this event. To do that, we're going to open the event as a page. So if you hover over the event and you click open, it'll open the page of the event here. Now, Every time we define a new event, every time we're speccing out a new event, you see we're speccing out this event, it means the progress, there's no progress yet because it hasn't been defined. What we're going to do is use the event template. So just click on this button, and what will pop up is everything the developer will need to know to go implement this event. So this event should fire whenever the user clicks the book a demo button on the homepage, or it could be multiple pages, could be wherever, right? This to me is one of the most critical pieces of speccing out an event like this, is clearly defining where it should fire, where and when it should fire, right? And we want to be extra clear. So for instance, if I did say on the homepage, a developer might look at that and go, okay, well, they only want it says just on the homepage. So if they book a demo on the blog, right? There's a book a demo button. There's a schedule and analytics consultation. There might be a book a demo button here. I guess they don't want me to add it there, right? We want to clearly define where that should fire. This should fire every time that a user clicks the book a demo button. Okay, a brief little side tip about this, right? When we're speccing out when events should fire, in general, when we're defining important events like order completed or other events, we don't want to define those events. We don't want to base those events on clicks, right? Because clicks, things can go wrong with clicks. If I click the confirm purchase button, I haven't made the purchase yet. The purchase event still has to be sent to the server. The server has to respond with, yes, you successfully completed a purchase, right? So the best thing we can do is define those events as clearly as we can from the user's perspective. So in this case, we really are talking about just a user clicking book a demo. But if this event were demo booked, right? So the user actually booked a demo, we would not want to define this as users clicking the book a demo button, right? We would want to use whenever the user actually successfully, might be a better word, books a demo. Cool. That's as clear as we should need to be, right? Now, there will be technical details for the development team to figure out how to do that as effectively as possible. We're not going to worry about that now. The important thing is that we're defining when it should happen as clearly and accurately as possible. Okay, so let's go back and let's go back to our simple book a demo clicked. That's straightforward, right? We're not going to do it just on the home page, anywhere on the site. Cool. Okay, so we've done that. Now, to get this, so we've already defined our properties, right? You can see here, this is showing the properties that apply to this. We added button color, click, call to action, stuff like that. Okay, good. And now, if you're not comfortable writing code, you may not want to add sample code. That's okay, but it is pretty straightforward. The template makes it pretty easy to add sample code. So you'll see here that we have 4 different types of sample code. There are others available in Segment. I've tried to include the most common ones, right? Those are JavaScript, by far is going to be the most common use case. Below that, you might have Java for a Android app. You might have Swift for Swift or Objective-C for an iOS app. In our case, all of the examples we're going to do are going to be generated with JavaScript because that is far and away the most common. Cool. So we'll click here, and you'll see it just fills in a template like this. Now, this is where we're going to replace that with this this JavaScript sample code generator that we created over here. Cool. So we're just going to select over this, and we're just going to paste, get rid of the extra space, and then there we're done, right? It says book a demo clicked. Now, you'll notice here that the click text, these are all auto-filled based on these properties up here. We don't want to create like a new click text property for each event, because then that risks that we define it differently. Sometimes it's called click text, sometimes it's called clicked text, whatever. We want to have nice, clear property names that are consistent across all of our objects. We don't want to recreate different properties, right? We want to use consistent properties. That helps with analysis later and everything else, right? But as a result, the sample code fills in some nonsensical, sometimes nonsensical buttons, right? So this is probably a Calendly link, right? So if we wanted to do this, I think this book a demo button is in fact a Calendly link, but we can just go, hey, copy the link address, right? And you'll see here when I paste that in here, sure enough, it's Calendly link, right? That's not the same click URL that's up here. That's fine, right? But this helps the developer understand, like, okay, what is the click URL for this? This is a sample click URL. They're going to have to write this code. This is not something that they could just copy and paste, right? But it's a great start. They could copy and paste this code and then fill it in with the variables they need. Obviously, the click text in this case is book a demo. And this just helps clarify for the developers, oh, I see what they want us to track. The color's purple, that's obvious, right? I need to actually get the color of the button, right? In this case, the button's not purple. The button color is, white, right? Okay, I get it. If I were a developer looking at this, I would go, oh, I see. They want the color of the button. That makes sense. Okay, got it. The object in action. These are the object in action from here. I find it really useful to always include the object in the action as properties. That helps with analysis later. It's not strictly necessary. If you're not doing that, feel free to remove the object and action properties. They are, of course, duplicate information up here. So you can do that. You do not have to include them. I like to include them. I think it's obvious. It's not very difficult for a developer to do this. But up to you how you want to do that. Okay, cool. And now you can see here, even though we're not coders, it's pretty straightforward how to define what this track call should look like. And now a developer, we have now that we've fully spec'd this out, this is everything a developer should need to go ahead and actually implement this event. So to take it from the to spec status to do, all we have to do is add a task. So let's do that. So we'll go ahead and just click new here. And by default, if you just add as the word, it will create the description, add book a demo call, click to, and we need to add a source. Where is this going to? This is going to go to the marketing site. Okay, now the reason why you want to add you may want to add multiple events, right? Or multiple tasks to a single track call is this track call might exist in different sources, right? If it existed in multiple sources down here, so here we see the sources that it's connected to. It's connected to the marketing site. If it were also connected, say, to the web app, right? Book a demo clicked might not be, but plenty of events might exist in both. Like I said, if you have an iOS and an Android app, then you're likely going to implement each track call is going to be implemented in both the iOS and the Android app, right? Then we want to add multiple tasks to this, right? So in this case, this is the marketing site. We see we have to add it, right? But we might also want to add it to the web app in this case. And then as we see here, the marketing site and the web app both have to add the book a demo clicked, right? Now, the reason why we separate it out like this is because each team might be using, this might be a different team that's responsible for the marketing site and the web app, right? Again, very typical for Android and iOS to use different to have different teams developing those. And so we need to track these separately. If you have a simple site, it's usually the case that you will only have one task per track call, but it's not necessarily the case. So that's why we have this here. And you can see it's broken up by web app. Now, you can add additional tasks to this. So you could add something that's like test book a demo. You could add a test event if you really wanted to, right? You see there, I put that on no source. So let's go ahead and add that to a source. We could say the marketing site, right? I could add whatever I want here. I could add more than one task, right? And then as the developer comes through and completes them, they can tick these off, right? And you'll see the progress updates. The status will go from to do to in progress. And as I complete all of these, it goes to completed. Cool. Great. So once I've added my to-dos, I have fully spec'd this out. It is now in to-do. The developer could come and use this and go implement this in Segment, right? Great. One more quick note about the tasks. You don't have to do this by default, but sometimes it can be useful to also define an implementation method. Now, in most cases, it's not necessary because you're going to use one implementation method per source. You don't always have to do that, but that is most typical. So for instance, on web apps, you're going to use JavaScript most of the time, right? In an iOS app, you're going to be using Swift or Objective-C, one or the other most of the time. However, there are cases where you might have different implementation methods. So for instance, there's a JavaScript template that I wrote for segment events. You might use that on your marketing sites, right? And you might also use some hard-coded JavaScript. The reason why it's good to add the implementation method if you are using different events is so that way, if something's wrong with that event, I know where it's firing from and I can go quickly find it. Is it in Google Tag Manager or is it hard-coded, right? So that is the implementation method. Like I said, not super critical for most sites, right? But can be useful. Okay, cool. And then as I demonstrated, as the user comes and clicks these off, the status will go from progress to completed. Good. Okay. Now, let's take a look at some of these predefined events. So as I said, they're all spec'd out, right? Over here, they're connected to different specs. We've added them by default because it can take quite a long time to add all of the properties and everything necessary to each of these. Right. So let's take a look at the order completed event because this one applies to almost every site that is selling something. That includes B2B SaaS and obviously e-commerce websites. Now you notice here, this event in this case has a lot of properties, right? That's why we've predefined it for you so you don't have to add each of these, right? Each of these, the developer can click on them, can click on name, for instance, and see what this property should be. Okay, it's the name of the product. I get it, right? Examples, t-shirt, etc. All right. Cool. And I say, and here we've defined it, you're going to have to, based on what kind of site you are, you may want to update this description, right? In the simple example here of an e-commerce website, that's the most intuitive, we want to fire this event whenever an order or transaction was successfully completed by the customer. So that's what we talked about before. It's not hitting the order button. We don't want to use proxies whenever possible. We don't want to rely on button clicks because those can be inaccurate. We want it to be when the user actually made the purchase event. And it's good to have a meeting with your developers and emphasize that to them, that what we want is when this order completed, when the order is actually completed, right? Okay, cool. And I have a quick note here because this is a little counterintuitive. Why would this be in the B2B SaaS, B2B SaaS events, orders, customers don't really place orders in B2B SaaS events, right? The reason why is because like I mentioned before, if you use this order completed event for the first purchase of the user, so if it's a B2B SaaS company and the order that customer is placing is subscribing for the first time, we're going to send an order completed event, because that's how we're going to tell our other destinations like Facebook and Google ads that this was the actual purchase event, right? So if we use order completed, Segment will translate it to what the destination expects, i.e. purchase events, right? So Facebook expects purchase, maybe, I don't know, but Pinterest expects it to be called, order complete, et cetera, right? Any of those sources, any of those destinations are equally important for B2B SaaS companies as they are for e-commerce sites. So we use order completed, right? There's a lot of properties down here, right? So not all of these may apply to every customer, right? Every use case, right? We may not have shipping addresses, for instance, for digital products, right? So for B2B SaaS, there may not even be separate products, right? That's okay. Just come in and remove those properties if they don't apply to you, right? So important to get this event right. Almost everybody is selling something on the internet. If you're selling something on the internet, be it B2B SaaS, e-commerce, direct-to-consumer brands, whatever, you should have an order completed event. Cool. And of course, that is a conversion. Good. Okay. So, as I said, this will far and away take the most time, right? Is specking out all of these track events. Hopefully, many of the default events should be in here predefined. You may have to go in and update them a little bit to apply them to your use case, but they are available here, right? So that should speed things along quite a bit. Okay, cool. Now let's go turn our attention to identify calls, right? Identify calls are ways that we identify users, right? So it's a way that we say, for instance, when we know that this person who came to our website, they placed an order and now we know that they're Kevin, right? We want to fire an identify calls. As such, identify calls, unlike events in Segment, identify calls don't have names that actually make it into the API call, right? But in the tracking plan, we're still going to define a name, so that way it's clear when and where and how those identify calls should fire. So this is not something that is being sent to Segment. It's just a part of the tracking plan, so we understand where those should fire. So for instance, in the example I gave, Kevin came to our website from a Facebook ad. He clicked around for a little bit, and then eventually he actually placed an order. So we fired the order completed event. We also want to identify him, because now we know that he's not just some anonymous user on the website. He's actually this guy named Kevin with all these things, right? So we know a lot of important stuff about someone when they complete an order. Typically we know if it's an e-commerce website, we know like their address, their first and last name, their phone number. Very important, we know their email address. That's typically one of the most important traits that we can define about a user. Anytime we're capturing an email address, we should be firing an identify call. That's a good rule. All right, but the most important part of the identify call is the user ID, right? As it says here, the user ID is a unique identifier for the user in your database, right? The user ID is, the user ID should be the user ID in your actual database. What does that mean? If you're a B2B SaaS company, your developers have a database and they have a table called users or something like that, or customers, whatever, right? They have a table. That table has a unique identifier for each user. That is what this user ID should be. You should not use other things. Don't use an email address as the user ID. Use the actual identifier, the unique identifier. If it's a UID, it looks like this. It also might be auto incremented, so it might be a number like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's probably a UID if you have your own site. Cool. Good. If you're an e-commerce website, this would typically be the customer ID. So for instance, on Shopify websites, there's a unique customer ID assigned to everybody. That's the identifier we want to use, right? So really important to define what is the user ID, get on the same page with your developers about what that is, because it's going to be essential to identifying these users and doing what's called identity resolution down the road. Identify calls are ultimately how Segment does identity resolution. That's how we know that the person who came from this Facebook ad and clicked on a bunch of stuff before they made a purchase, that was the same person who made the purchase, whose name is Kevin, right? Identity resolution, very important. Cool. And then there's a bunch of other things, right? You might have, if you have a subscription product that uses Stripe, you might have a separate customer ID from your user ID. You have a user ID in your actual database. You have a customer ID in Stripe. Good to put that information there as well, right? It helps us connect our different sources later on. We might know a bunch of other stuff about the user. We probably know first name, last name, or name, just their name. That's fine as well. Phone number, etc. Might know a lot of stuff, right? Again, there's a sample code here. Come in and feel free to, like, if you're a B2B SaaS and you don't know their location, delete that stuff. Right? That's totally fine. Cool. Good. And then there's another important piece about the identify calls. Just like in the track calls, we wanted to define when this identify call should happen for the developers. We want to do the same thing for the identify call, right? So this identify call should fire whenever a user completes an order. Now, there's a key thing about identify calls. If we are firing both a track call and an identify call, right, for the same thing that happened on the website, in this case, order completed, we want to fire the identify call first, right? Why? Because all of these traits that we're defining here for the user will be attached to the track call without us having to add them manually. So fire identify calls before track calls every time. Good. Cool. And then traits down here, these are analogous to properties on events. Traits are things we know about the user, right? So you'll notice the difference between traits and properties. Properties apply to the event. That might be like order ID, right? The user's name, that is a trait of the user. It doesn't change with each event. Now, there's a lot of overlap. Sometimes you will have a lot of things that are both a property of the event and a property of the user. For instance, you might have the city, right? Might be the city that the billing address, and it might also be the city of the user, right? The important distinction here is that traits will always be applied to the user, and they will actually overwrite in Segment. There's a table that Segment creates called users that shows the most up-to-date traits for each user. So the traits will be attached to the user. They will always show the most recent identify call, unless you leave postal code. For instance, if we call another identify call later and we leave postal code out, right, then Segment will keep the most recent postal code that it's seen for the user. That's trait calls. Cool. All right. The most standard identify calls are user ID identify calls. What that means is we have a user ID trait for the user. We can uniquely identify the user. The calls look like this. This is a user ID, right? And here's a bunch of traits, right? Here's a bunch of traits about the user, right? Cool. So that is a user ID identify call. There's another type of identify call that's an anonymous identify call. What that means is we have not yet assigned a user ID to this user. So the classic example would be they've subscribed to a newsletter or another sort of email, right? They come to our website, they subscribe to our email, but they don't sign up for a SaaS app, or they haven't placed an order yet, right? We don't have a unique user ID for them yet. But we do know something really important about them, i.e. their email address, right? So in that case, what we want to do is make an anonymous user ID call. So we flag it as anonymous so that way the developer knows we're not expecting to have a user ID for this user, right? We define where it is. It should fire whenever a user subscribes to our email list. As usual, there's an associated track call. This should fire before it, right? And you'll see in this case, there's no user ID. User ID is not a trait. We don't have a user ID for this person yet. We're just flagging that we have captured their email, right? And we're putting some additional information that they're a subscriber, right? That would be fairly typical. Depends on your email list setup. You might add additional things. You might have something like email list. You could add that here, right? Great, cool. Good. So those are identify calls. And finally, we have group calls. Group calls are not going to be used by everybody. If you have an e-commerce website or a consumer-facing app, you're probably not going to have group calls. Group calls are most common for B2B SaaS apps. What they are is kind of the next level of identify calls. So identify calls uniquely identify users. In B2B SaaS apps, we also typically have accounts or companies or groups, some group of users that's really important to us. Accounts would be really common, right? So, in the case of my B2B SaaS app here, right? A single Shopify store might have a bunch of users that need to look at their analytics, right? We want to be able to see those analytics by their we want to be able to look at our internal analytics, our segment tracking plan. We want to be able to group a bunch of users into a single account. That's what group calls are. They work very, very similarly to identify calls. Again, we're going to flip into the adding view if we're going to add a bunch, and I could add new down here. But let's just pop one open and take a look, right? So the first time a first user signs up for an account, they create an account. There's an account created event, right? In that case, we have the name of the group, right? The example here is Initech, right? They might have a plan that the group is on, and they have a separate, it's not the same as the user ID, it's a different identifier for the group in the database. In this case, we call them accounts, but companies, there's a bunch of different names for that kind of stuff. And this is what the group call looks like. These are the same traits. This is linked to the same table traits that identify calls are linked to because there's a lot of overlap between the traits that apply to users and the traits that apply to groups. Like I said, works very similar to how identify calls work. Okay, cool. So once we have specced out our spec like this, our tracking plan, we've specced out all of our events, identify calls, group calls, and their associated properties and traits. We could come back here, come back to the homepage, and we can see the status of everything. You will have to flip these views back into their default view for everything to look nice, but you can see the status of everything, whether something's implemented or not, whether the identify call is implemented. Cool. And you can see, if you put this in remaining, you can see the remaining tasks to be done. Cool. And then there's some miscellaneous information down here, namely the specs and the implementation methods. Good. Cool. Once you've done this, you can hand it over to the developer, right? And they can use this to create your plan. I really strongly recommend that if the developer has comments, they can flag you in the comments directly here, so that way you have the context and everything, and you can respond directly there. It also adds some traceability. That's a useful feature of creating a tracking plan in Notion like this. Cool. Feel free, of course, to delete any of this information that's no longer relevant to you, right? I would recommend leaving the things in gray because that's the documentation of how to use this. And then one benefit of creating, the real benefit of a tracking plan like this is not only is it clear, it really solves a key problem between a key problem that comes up over and over and over again with analytics is that Marketing and product are usually the people that benefit the most from having strong analytics, but it takes developers to implement that analytics correctly. Right? There are lots of tools that try to get around that, but that's really, at the end of the day, that is the problem. Segment very much expects developers to go implement a tracking plan. But with this tool, the marketing team, the product team, whoever can define the tracking plan and hand it over to the developers to allow them to use it. Cool. The other important thing about this is once your team has gone and implemented the tracking plan, it's easy to come in here and update the tracking plan. So if you add a new event, just like we did with Book a Demo, right? The Book a Demo click, you can go ahead and add that here and hand it over to the developer and they can do it. And then the other important thing, it's really important to have um, clear documentation about where events are firing, right? Not just some PDF or Excel file somewhere that hasn't been updated in 5 years, but something useful that a new team member or even an old team member that hasn't looked at it in a while can come in and see, like, okay, like, are we firing a user signed in event? Oh yeah, cool. We're already firing that. Good. Or, oh, it hasn't been implemented yet. Well, we need to go get that implemented, right? Those are the kinds of things that it's really helpful to have a clear tracking plan like that. You can share the tracking plan with anybody you like. You can copy it to your website, to your Notion instance. You can add people by emails and groups, or you can share it to the web if you want to share it with someone external. So really the power here is clarity about what we're doing, help the developers implement it, get developers and marketing or product on the same page. And then going forward, clarity about what events are actually firing. Do we need to add new ones or do they already exist? And that's really how to get a lot of value out of your segment plan. Hope this has been helpful. I hope you find the template useful, and we will talk to you later.